I was so excited to get my first Game Gear. I imported it from Japan a bit before the North American launch, and played the hell out of Columns, Super Monaco GP, and G-Lock Air Battle until US games started trickling out. I always felt the system was something special considering it launched in 1990, providing portable color graphics and gameplay that were often exceptional given the competition and era that it was released in. That's why I wanted to do this episode. We will be looking at some games that were exclusive on the system and how they fared. Sometimes they were unforgettable across the board, while other times they were complete and utter disappointments. I've got 10 games for you here, let's get started. In late 1995, Sega and Eaton Entertainment Software released Arena: Maze of Death exclusively for the Game Gear. This is an isometric run-and-gun maze game that has you finding keycards and mowing down enemies along the way. You can find different weapons as you explore, which include spread shots, lasers, and missile launchers. This is a fairly straightforward game. You are dropped into a hostile environment and must find your way out. It looks good, sounds okay, and the gameplay is mainly just point and shoot. A Master System version was supposedly done as well but never released, leaving this a Game Gear only title that has never seen a port to anything else. It's pretty basic in its appeal, but for a portable game, I'd say it's definitely worth a look. In late 1991, Sega released Axe Bad Ler: A Legend of Golden Axe, an action RPG hybrid based in the Golden Axe universe and takes place after the events of the first game. If Golden Axe Warrior was a clone of Zelda, then this here is certainly a close approximation of Zelda 2. You have the run-of-the-world in an overhead map sequence where you are thrust into random battles that take place in side-scrolling action sequences. When you make it to a town, you continue in the overhead mode and can explore, buy items, gain new abilities, and talk to NPCs. There are also areas on the map that switch to the side-scrolling action mode for exploration and fighting enemies. All in all, the visuals, sound, and gameplay are all kinda average, but I do have some problems with its design. Random battles can come right on top of one another for long stretches that makes this an absolute chore to play through at times. I mean just one after another, moving just a single block or two. It really grates on the nerves. If you can get past that aspect of it though, this is a fun little adventure with enough to do to keep you busy for a day or two. In 1995, Sega of America decided that it would curse the Sega faithful with yet another complete pile of dog shit called Chicago's Syndicate. In this side-scrolling action game, you take control of Larson Tyler of Eternal Champions fame. His job is to rid the streets of gangs and clean up the place. Before I go any further, I should let you know that I appreciate what the developers were shooting for here. It's a side-scrolling beat-em-up with the complexity of a fighting game. You get different punches, kicks, backflips, and projectiles, and had it all worked out, it could have been special. The problem is that it didn't work out, and instead it's just one big mess right from the get-go. First, the sound and music here is ear-piercing. I mean, it's the kind of stuff you honestly have to put up a big WTF and wonder just what the hell the developers were thinking. The military could blast this shit into a war zone and have the fighting end in mere hours, the enemy completely paralyzed by its unholy melody. Luckily you can turn the sound off, but you can't do anything about the atrocious gameplay. Here you are trapped with a moveset that simply doesn't work. Most are so slow it's like your character is trapped in molasses, and when you do find the one or two strikes fast enough, you find that's all you'll use. over and over and over and over again. Enemies take far too long to kill, and they repeat far too often as well. This is the kind of dreck that Sega of America drowned the market in the later years of the Genesis, and the poor Game Gear would get more of the same. It's easily some of Sega's most shameful work. Luckily, Sega of Japan was still involved in Game Gear publishing, and the Japanese exclusive CocaCola Kid was released in mid-1994. It was done by Aspect, the company responsible for a number of the 8-bit Sonic titles, and that influence is felt all over CocaCola Kid here. You have a spin dash-like attack that rips through enemies and walls, and it even feels like the 8-bit Sonic titles in visual style and music. You can also wall jump, ride skateboards, jump kick, and there is a ton of platforming to do. The animation is solid, and while the stage design can be frustrating, it does play pretty good. There is a story to it that has an English translation if you are interested, and in Japan, there was a special edition system released with a red cartridge of this game. It's a decent one, and I recommend it to all who enjoy the 8-bit Sonic titles. In early 1995, Sega released RISC Star for the Game Gear. I know what you're thinking, RISC Star was released on the Genesis. It was, but what is here is actually a different game in regards to many aspects of its design. Stage layouts have some pretty big changes, and there are the additions of collectible stars for extra men. There is also an additional power-up that makes RISC Star faster and invincible for a short while. Outside of that, wow, is this a great freaking game. It's absolutely beautiful, sounds great, and they even managed to capture the feel of the 16-bit version's gameplay, right down to its excellent animation. You will not find many better looking or playing games on this platform than this, and it's a must if you like the 16-bit version. Sega of Japan was back again, making Sega fans proud with Shinobi 2: The Silent Fury, released in late 1992. This is a sequel to the first Shinobi title on the Game Gear, and it again employs the use of different colored ninjas with different skills. You start as the classic red ninja Joe Musashi, and with each defeated stage you open up the use of another character. Stages can be played in any order, and often must be played more than once to find everything you need. Like the original, this is a great looking and sounding game, and one that makes great use of the colors the system was capable of. Gameplay is fast, smooth, and responsive, and easily one of the better action games the platform would receive in its lifetime. I always wanted Sega to remaster these two games for the Genesis using the Shinobi 3 engine. They were so good they deserved to be on more than one platform. They still are, and hopefully one day Sega will realize that. In late 1995, US Gold and Freestyle joined up to make the Game Gear its very own Megaman game. And surprisingly, they didn't mess it up. This very much looks and sounds the part, and even the gameplay feels mostly the same. Stage design is pretty accurate from the NES editions, and even some of the boss battles were lifted from later games in that series. Of course, it also has some of the irritations of those games as well. Enemies reappear endlessly with just the slightest scroll of the screen, and there are blind deaths all over the place. Scroll the screen wrong and into spikes and bottomless pits your ass goes. Overall though, it's not a bad game at all, even if it lacks some of the polish that Capcom itself was capable of. In late 1991, the Game Gear got its very own Ninja Gaiden game, and despite often being shit on as the worst of these games, I enjoyed it. No, it's not anywhere near as good as the NES or Master System releases, but you know what? It's still not a bad game at all. It almost feels a bit more like an 8-bit Strider from Capcom than a Ninja Gaiden release, but it still plays well, and I really like the presentation here. There are some simple parallax effects in some of the backgrounds, and it even has a few nice bits of music in it. It can be hard in a few places, but it's short and most will be able to see the majority of the stages and bosses after only a few play sessions. There is a hidden password feature that makes this much more tolerable. Don't let the bad word of mouth get you down on this one. It's no masterpiece, but it's far from the shit stain on the series many claim it to be. In early 1994, Sega released XMen for the Game Gear, a completely different action platformer than the one we saw on the Genesis. In this one, both Cyclops and Wolverine must rescue the other X-Men in order to use them across the game's 6 stages. This is pretty straightforward in regards to gameplay. Most of the stages have an exploration aspect to them where you must find your way to the end boss, with life and power-up items hidden in the nooks and crannies. Each character has a basic attack and special moves that require its own power bar to use. It's nothing exceptional in regards to graphics and sound, though I don't think either one of these things are bad. For a portable game, the stages are rather large and it does take a while to find your way around. The difficulty can be a bit much, but otherwise, this is a good game for a few play sessions. In late 1992, the Game Gear got its very own version of Taz-Mania that was different from both the Master System and Genesis editions. Sega of America got a small developer known as NewFX to do the work, and it's another stunning example of just how poor a game could be under this process. This is by far the worst of these games to be released under the Sega umbrella. A piss-poor mix of eye-gouging visuals and droning, coma-inducing sound and music that rivals the worst of that entire generation. It starts off with Taz trying to outrun a deadly boulder that will kill him with one hit. The thing is, you have to do it just right to get past the stage, which is much harder than a first stage should be thanks to the awful scrolling and animation. But it's the second stage that makes you go running for the power button, so you don't have to see or hear this sensory assassin any longer. Nothing I can say will explain this shitpile any better than actually letting you experience it. I'll just leave a few seconds of gameplay here for your torture. You have been warned, I'd cut the sound down if I were you. It's amazing to me the massive divide in quality software between the East and the West on Sega systems. Sega of Japan had a much better understanding of what made a game great, even when it came to stuff they only published. Sega of America often outsourced its game development to studios that lacked the same skill for quality software, resulting in stuff that quite frankly was awful more often than not. This is as clear as day when looking at the software for the Sega Genesis. When Sega of Japan was in control of all its games early in its life, you got a steady flow of software that was pretty damn solid, and only a handful of stinkers here and there. After Sega of America began its software flow in 1993 and onward, things completely flipped. We got games that had huge peaks and valleys in terms of quality, and the great sound of the early games for the system were replaced by stuff that just eviscerated the hardware's reputation. This trend also continued on the Game Gear here. The stuff published and developed in Japan was almost always worth playing, while the US branch shat the bed on an almost consistent basis. I know some of you disagree with that, but when it comes to what I find worth playing, Sega of Japan was, and continues to be, the division responsible for most of Sega's best games by a wide margin. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.